Welcome to the SDA Housing Podcast, brought to you by NDIS Property Australia. Before starting this episode, we need to provide a general disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast is general in nature only. It does not take into account the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. You need to consider your financial situation and needs before making any decisions based on the information in this podcast. And you should consider seeking independent and professional advice for your personal circumstances. All right, let's begin.
Hello everybody, my name is Minh and I'm your host from NDIS Property Australia, hosting the SDA Housing Podcast, a show that explains, highlights, guides and brings awareness about all things SDA in this ever-changing NDIS world. Today we have a special guest speaker from Newcastle way, I think. It is Richard Williams. Richard, how are you?
Very well, thanks, Minh.
Mate, we've invited you on to this podcast to hear your journey as a investor, developer, SDA investor, I guess, and we'll be very curious to hear your journey and let our listeners hear the highs and lows of doing it all yourself as a local developer down there, and go from there. So basically, but first of all, Richard, what's your background before you actually got into the SDA life? Yeah.
Sure, Minh. My background is 20 plus years with Defence, with Air Force, and during that time I moved around Australia a bit to some different locations. And as I moved around, I developed an interest in property investing, followed shortly thereafter with property developing. The first property development project I actually did was a joint venture, a syndicate with about 6 other guys from work, where we bought an old house, knocked it down and got the approvals to build a duplex. That was just before the global financial crisis, so there were some really good learning opportunities that came out of that. We didn't end up building the 2 new dwellings. We actually sold the property with the approvals. And from there on, I continued doing small developments. I couldn't necessarily do them on my own. So the next project I did was with some friends. We, again, bought an old house on in an existing area, and we knocked the house down and built a duplex, and we kept one each. And as I moved around with work, I continued doing these small projects, and, I've done them in multiple states now. And probably about 4 or so years ago, I picked up a nice little property. It was a corner block in Newcastle. It was 1 title and 2 lots. And there was an existing house in the middle of the block, weatherboard on piers. And what the plan was to actually pick this house up as a Queenslander, get the truck in under the house, pick the house up, move it across onto one of the lots. Yep. And that left me with a nice vacant corner lot. And it was approximately 400 metres from the local tavern, from Coles and the shopping centre, across the road from Aldi. It had 3 accessible bus routes and a bus stop straight out the front of the house. And I was looking for opportunities on what I could do with this new vacant block of land to provide a good long-term housing opportunity as to whether I sell it on or a property I build and keep. And that was about the same time I met some people that were getting into SDA, and they had some relationships with some providers. So I got chatting to these people and developed a level of comfort around SDA and the things that you need to be careful of, and really how do you find that participant demand? And, until you find that right SDA to work with, should you even build SDA? And that was the first obstacle I had to overcome, Minh, was working out, if I build in Newcastle in this particular area, is there going to be demand?
So may I ask you, how many months of due diligence to understand what this SDA market was all about before you really became comfortable in actually doing something?
That's been quite a journey, Minh. There was the initial conversations and I had a level of comfort, but initially I was chatting with an SDA that wasn't within that local Newcastle market. And they were kind of like, yeah, sure, we've got some relationships. Yes, we'll be able to get people, and that we don't see any problems here. And then I kind of branched out and continued to do some research and become more familiar in the disability space around Newcastle, chatting with both the companies that provide those in-home supports to people living with disabilities in SDA properties, as well as to some of the SDA providers. And that was a long conversation over a number of months, Minh. And during that time, initially I had some plans just for a regular house. I found a designer who was comfortable in the SDA space, though admittedly they hadn't actually designed anything in the SDA space previously, but they were super enthusiastic. They were happy to read about the design standards and learn about them. And they came on the journey with me, which was fantastic. And they've now designed a number of SDA properties in a number of states for a number of different developers and builders. So that's been really good. And, I caught up with them for lunch yesterday and we went through the property and I showed them some of the issues that we'd had during construction and how we had to resolve those and how on future designs that they should incorporate things and do things slightly different to help that part of the build process.
Do you want to give a free plug to your designer to get more business?
Just trying to think what his company name is, but he's a local Newcastle guy, so feel free to reach out to me for the details on that later.
So moving on, design,
yes.
Okay, good. Providers, yep. Local area. So what else was on your to-do list for due diligence before you actually put your foot in the water?
Look, I suppose there was the working out how all the jigsaw puzzle pieces fit together. We've got the local planning rules, we've got the council DCP and the LEP, but then we've also got the SDA design standards and then the Building Code of Australia. So working out how these separate bits of documentation fit together was quite the journey. And, initially the house just started off as an application for a dwelling house and then it progressed to an application for a group home. And it was quite the learning journey along the way, starting to chat with the providers and the SDA assessor on refining the floor plan before we submitted it, and then waiting while it sat in council for approvals.
Missing is the builder. Were there challenges with finding a builder or someone who's experienced or not experienced or who are enthusiastic as well? Or?
Yeah, definitely. And for that particular project, a mate of mine was actually the builder. And he was comfortable in the space. It did, from a contracting perspective, it worked out better in the long run on the price having done that. But essentially, we were working on a cost plus type contract. So any quality issues that were not correct, that was basically a double payment for myself. There was a number of issues we had along the way, as I'm sure you're familiar with. All our floor ramps. Minimum or maximum sort of 3 mil lips or 5 mil if you've got a rounded bezeled edge on it. So, our biggest problems were around the quality and the tolerances. It was quite a narrow block, so we were constrained in how wide the rooms could be. But our biggest problems were around sort of build tolerances and construction tolerances on site, from the trades, whether they be the carpenters putting the frames up, the tilers, making sure that the tiles and the floors were compliant, again, to AS 1428, which is not referenced specifically in other documentation, but it's part of that little jigsaw puzzle of documentation and rules that you need to comply with. So I think the main challenge, Minh, was when the assessor came back and said, hey, this is not quite right. And it's like, well, where do we find that in the design standard? And it's like, well, it's not in the design standard. It refers out to Australian standards. So I suppose the places we lost the most time and the build duration pushed out a bit was really around that understanding and yes, having a builder that was familiar in the SDA space would have been beneficial, but working closely with the SDA assessor was able to mitigate a lot of that. We paid for additional assessments along the way, so we had multiple progress inspections before we made any irrecoverable errors. We had some paths or an access way where the builder during construction, a post went up and it was closer to the dwelling than allowable. So, we had to get that post moved to make sure we were compliant. Again, that's a Building Code of Australia type requirement for the group home type dwellings, not specifically SDA related. But again, all these things fit in together. So I think the main risk and on this particular project, I worked much closer with the builder than you normally would. Normally you'd sign a build contract and you'd hand the site over to the builder and they'd just deliver you a product. But I was quite cognizant that if we did that, particularly with a builder that was comfortable building but had not done SDA before, that they didn't know the intricacies of the design standard and other documents. So it was really a case of continual conversations with the builder saying, hey, when you do this, don't forget that this needs to be compliant. Don't forget about making sure the floor's nice and flat. Make sure that where we've got the sliding door at the back door that, we don't have more than, a 35 mil drop as we go outside the back door. Make sure we don't have big lips on the tiles. It was just making sure that level of supervision and quality was there in the build. And as I mentioned, Min, there were a couple of problems on the tiling where we had to get some work redone. And again, with the carport, with the garage area, we needed to make sure that the feet, or more so on the bottom of the posts, the tabs that the dyno bolts go through, that, the steel manufacturer had installed them on the inside of the legs rather than on the sides or the outside. So it impinged onto what should have been a flat surface area. So, we had to pay the steel maker to come out and cut those off and then re-weld them on a different part of the posts. So just small little issues like that. And we resolved them as we went along prior to the SDA assessor coming out.
So, and, Richard, here's a question.
Sure.
If it wasn't the whole friendship thing with your mate, who's the builder,
yes,
and you weren't involved as you were, could there have been a lot of issues pop up later on where they're non-compliant?
100%. We had multiple issues, is not quite the right word.
And then also, the way you explain this to me, it seems like you brought in the assessor later on, not at the start. Is that correct?
No, the assessor was involved from the plan stage. Yeah. So we were always building with compliant plans. Mm-hmm. And we had the plans signed off by the assessor, or the concepts, prior to actually lodging them with council.
But yet you're saying right now, if you weren't involved with the builder, there would have been issues pop up because of his inexperience? Is that the way I'm reading it?
Yes, and as much any builder you've got will only have a limited number of employees. And, those employees, for example, might be carpenters, but they're going to get subcontractors out, for the electrician, for the plumber. And any of these things can be a problem, if the power points or the light switches are at the wrong height or they're too close to a corner of the wall, then all of a sudden, your building can be non-compliant. One of the biggest potential issues we had was, for example, the concrete pouring, where paths had the potential not to be the right width. The concrete could have been too steep. And, once the concrete slab or driveway is down, the whole house can be non-compliant just due to someone doing a good quality and standard of work, but it just doesn't meet the specification requirements. So it's certainly a big issue for anyone considering doing SDA. If it's just a contract that you sign and then you stand back and leave it all to the builder, if they're not experienced in SDA, you risk getting a house that's non-compliant in the first instance. Sure, you're likely to be able to fix it, but depending on how far past that area you've gone, the cost to fix it could be in the tens of thousands or more.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, luckily it's a friend of yours, and luckily you were really involved in it to deliver the finished product the way it should have been done. But a lot of other people out there, I'm sure around Australia, who will be cutting corners, right? Meaning not engaging a assessor early enough and or working with builders who may not be experienced at all and or are cutting corners themselves. I've heard some shocking stories out there around Australia with build finishes, which just do not conform to the FDA guidelines, and that's because they just cut corners, And at the end of the day, the person that has to wear the responsibility is the investor who engages that builder, obviously, yeah.
Yeah, 100%, Min. Like, it's all well and good that the builder hands you over a house that has an occupation certificate, but they need to go above and beyond that to meet all the SDA requirements. And so, yeah, there's definitely benefits for those that are thinking of doing SDA for the first time to go with a builder that's experienced in the area, or to have those relationships with the builder and the time, effort and energy to make sure it stays on track.
So that's your first build?
Yes.
Was that a house or a...
Yep, that's a house, Min.
That was the first project? Yep. And
yes.
The projects what were they next? The next one.
Yep, so 2 other projects. One is a 3-villa site. So the house that's just finished has a couple of high physical support rooms. So we're looking to have the first participant moved in within about 6 to 8 weeks of occupation certificate, which I'm told is fantastic within the industry. And the next project is 3 villas. So the multi-resident dwelling added some additional complexity, and I'm happy just to go back to a nice simple model aiming to build little villa-style houses, 2-bedroom houses, built specifically for the purpose of one person living in each of those. And then the second room can be for the OOA, for the on-site care, as required, or the benefit of having multiple of these on the one site is that depending on the resident requirements, maybe there's one carer shared across multiple participants and or dwellings. But in doing this, it's 3 2-bedroom villas. So each villa is nice and separate, giving the opportunity to have a little private house for each of the participants. But we get 3 on the block, so we've got a little miniature community of sorts, which also has the added benefit for the care provider of being able to better adjust their staff rosters to compensate for having multiple people to look after. That one I actually purchased DA approved, Min. However, it was not SDA compliant, so I modified the DA, and I've actually done that one as a 3 robust villas. The block has a bit of slope on it, so fraction too much slope to be either fully accessible or high physical support, and that's nice sort of single garage dwellings, which are slightly bigger than, say, a granny flat. In New South Wales, granny flats are about 60 square metres, so they're slightly bigger than that, and that's getting ready to start construction at the moment. So I'm working through finance. I have ordered a commercial valuation on that, and the valuation came back very favourable. It was actually slightly above where I expected it to be, and that is a special SDA valuation. One of the problems I found was the limited number of valuers within Australia that can actually do SDA valuations. And the problem with once you get an SDA valuation is you also need to be working with the right lender that can accept that valuation, because a number of the lenders and the valuers don't actually work with each other.
Yeah, gotcha. Which lender are you using, Maya?
Look, I've shortlisted it down to 2 lenders at the moment, Min. One is crowdfunding opportunity, so crowd property. They're definitely in the space, learning about the space. And another is a private capital lender, like a non-bank.
Yep, gotcha. In Queensland and Melbourne, there's different terminologies of villas. And I just want to understand what your villas are, because in Queensland, a villa is 3 separate dwellings on a site, whereas in Melbourne, Victoria, a villa is one building with separate apartments in the house, which is called a villa. So in New South Wales, you've built 3 villas. Are they separate dwellings, or are they under one roof, one building?
Great question, Min. So when I use the term villas, what I'm referring to is 3 strata-titled single-level dwellings. So 2 of them will actually have a common wall between the garages, so they'll be partially attached, and then one will be freestanding. And on completion, the three villas can be strata-titled. So essentially they're 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, single car garage, 3 of those that are all single-level on the one title with the potential to strata title, subdivide them on completion.
And you're doing all these to develop and hold or sell?
Yes, that's the plan, to hold them in. The yields are great, and I've had a couple of offers to sort of buy them off me, but the reality is for the offers to buy them at this stage, there's hundreds of thousands of dollars to be made, but the reality is that's only a few years of the income that could be obtained from holding the properties. So it's not particularly appealing option to sell them at this point in time.
Good. So when you first began your research 4 years ago, what kind of yields were you seeing out there with possibility? And then when you began your first and second builds, what were your feasibilities showing you as your most likely outcome for the gross yield and net yield for your projects?
Great question, Min. The one that's just completing, because I'm incorporating small developments with them, there are elements of uplift through doing that, small subdivision and build type element. So the yields would probably be slightly higher than others might achieve just by buying a block of land and putting a house on there. Yeah,
well, we're working in yields based on your acquisition price, obviously. So the uplift is your future gain, no worries at all. But from a project perspective, where acquiring the land, DAing it, building it yourself, what was your builders? What was your goal or conservative estimate for the yield versus what you think you'll end up with being after all the completion?
Yeah, of course. And okay, so I'll frame it in 2 parts. Like, I haven't actually sat down and done my percentage yields, but for the house that's just completed, the yield for that one will be, look, off the top of my head, around sort of that 18% type figure. If it's fully occupied with people that are fully funded to the highest levels possible that the house is designed to, the gross yield would be around about $130,000 to $140,000 per year on a cost of approximately $900,000. So quite an attractive yield. And the other villas, the 3 dwellings that are to be completed, gross yield will be about $205,000 on a cost of approximately $1.5 million. So there we're looking at 12-13% perhaps.
We always say in our podcast, Richard, and I think you'll agree with this, the best way to work out what your likely outcome is going to be for return is the maximum return, whatever that number is. 2/3 of that is where you're between 50% to 66% is where the actual end result is going to end up being. And if you as an investor are okay with that outcome, then that is what you should be aiming for as a retail investor with the end product partially filled or mostly filled. Because you should never ever assume a fully funded maximum occupancy of your dwelling.
Exactly, Min. And I've got a 3rd dwelling. It's on a battle axe block. It's a single dwelling for a single residence to be constructed to the high physical support level. And should I get a high physical support participant in there, the return could be approximately $75,000 per year. But if I don't get the full high physical support resident and I get a fully funded, fully accessible residence, then the income would be approximately $50,000 a year. And sure, that's quite a big difference between those two numbers. But the reality is I would still be a very happy property owner if I was getting an income of approximately $50,000 per year. And even if I did get someone at high physical support now, there may not always be someone at that funding level living in the property. So I 100% agree, Min. Do not do the numbers assuming 100% occupancy at the highest rate of funding, because experience says that not everyone's funded to the highest amount possible, and you may not get someone to that level all the time. And even with the property I've just finished, it's like, we told the provider whilst high physical support is, what we would prefer, if residents of a lower level of funding or fully accessible or something are who's available at the time, that's also still a really good outcome, and we're happy with that.
Let me ask you a question that I'm sure some of our listeners are thinking about while listening to this podcast that you and I are talking about. That if you built a house to begin with, your first project, a house, okay, and then you jumped into the villas scene. And it's rare to see investors or developers jump into the villas unless they really know what they're talking about or doing. Why didn't you consider a duplex or dual lock or a normal house as your second project?
Yeah, great question, Min. And I haven't considered the duplex type market because in sourcing a duplex property, I've got 2 ways I can source it. I can go into a new estate and I can buy a block of land where I can build 2 houses on it instead of 1. But land prices in those areas the last couple of years in particular have been skyrocketing. So the cost of that land has been quite expensive. The other way I could get a duplex block of land is I could buy an existing house and then I could knock it down and build a duplex. But again, that's quite an expensive way to acquire a block of land. So the reason I've gone to the villas is that the easiest and the cheapest way to acquire that block of land is to get a block of land with an existing house on it, whether that's on a corner or with a battle axe block potential, and then build a new villa behind the existing house. So that way I keep the intrinsic value of the existing house, which, with a bit of a renovation and then subdividing on completion of the build out the back, maintains most of its value. So I can actually end up with a relatively cheap block of land to build my new SDA dwelling on it. And that also gives me a point of difference where all of a sudden I'm in the infill market. I'm not in new greenfield subdivisions where people can get into trouble because they don't know how many other properties around their property have been built as SDA. So the properties I'm building, there's generally no SDA within, a few blocks, maybe even a few kilometres. So it's a nice point of difference that I can offer into the market, even if it is on quite a small scale.
What resources are you using, Richard, to know for sure there are no other builds in the area near your project?
Great question, Min. So one of those is looking at the planning alerts within New South Wales to see what's coming up as to who's planning group home type dwellings around the area. And to be honest, I'm not too fussed as to whether there are other SDA properties coming along. I'm chatting to the providers quite regularly, to the SDA provider, I'm chatting to them every couple of weeks to find out where they're at. And then to the in-home care providers, I'm chatting to them at least every couple of months to go, hey, looking forwards for future opportunities. What's your demand? Where are people looking to live? So to be honest, I'm relying less on that sort of NDIS government generated data and more to the people and providers that are actually on the ground on a daily basis and the support coordinators to say, hey, what's the inquiry you've got coming through for certain areas in Newcastle and surrounds? Where do you need properties? And the general feedback is, Richard, the market is undersupplied. Even if you bought on lots more of these at the moment, there's plenty of room for further growth.
I really congratulate and commend you for doing that. You network on the grassroots level in the community with the providers to understand more their needs. But out of curiosity, surely you looked at the data online, the quarterly reports, the SDA demand maps, and you use it as a reference. And my next question is, how accurate do you think, or delayed, that online data is by the NDIS compared to what you see on the ground yourself in Newcastle?
Yeah, 100%, Min. I'm looking at the data. What I would generally comment is that the support coordinators and care organisations are getting significantly higher inquiry than the NDIS provided data would indicate is currently there. And some of that could be due to people that are willing and happy and wanting to relocate, perhaps from other areas into a hub such as Newcastle. So while the data from NDIS is reporting on who's in Newcastle and who's looking at the moment, there's also people, who may be currently in Sydney with family up in Newcastle or further out the Hunter Valley that would like to move into a population centre such as Newcastle that may not be included in that data.
My advice to anyone listening is, do not think the data online, the demand maps and the quarterly reports are the be-all and end-all, the gospel of the data, because it's not. It isn't. Don't you agree, Richard?
Yeah, definitely, Min. Like in building these robust villas, talking to the provider, they're like, Richard, we're getting 2 inquiries a week for people wanting robust accommodation. They're like, how soon did you say you were finishing these? Can you finish them tomorrow and have some more for us, please?
It's always tomorrow, isn't it? They always, but the words are tomorrow, today, I need today.
Yeah, the demand is strong there at the moment, Min. We're definitely on that, at the start of the bell curve with regards to producing new SDA properties to replace all the legacy stock that's currently out there.
Do you know how much legacy is out there in the Newcastle Maitland area?
There's still a good number of group homes and the traditional stock, and I understand that works for the providers, particularly from the staffing perspective. But from the participant perspective, there's definitely a push towards newer SDA, but there is still significant legacy stock of group homes within the area.
So if the NDIS began in New South Wales 4 years ago, that means you've got 6 years left before those group homes and legacy stock are going to be defunded. So you've got a six-year window there to get some more stock. Build your portfolio up very quickly, Richard.
I'll do it as quick as I can, Min.
We need it today, mate. So the first house was HPS.
Yes.
The second project, the 3 villas, were HPS? Or?
They'll be robust.
Yeah. And the third project, 3 villas?
That's a single HPS villa, so for 1 occupant.
Here's a query I want to ask you. I've never thought about this, but I'm just thinking about it as you talk right now. There's a lot of chatter on online forums and providers talking about how the NDIA want to see more people in the 2, 3, 4 resident homes, because obviously it costs less to house these people. The single resident apartment kind of product is harder to get funding for SDA participants because it costs a lot more, obviously. But then I thought, hang on, villas are the same thing. Villas are also 1 resident dwelling. Surely the villas are also hard to get funding for as well, because they are also 1 resident like an apartment. How would you dispute or agree with this analysis, I guess?
It's something I've considered, Min, and it is still a level of risk. However, in my eyes, I can still mitigate that by, worst case, I could get a HPS participant who's funded to live with 2 or 3 other people. Yes, it's a lower rate of funding, but it's still a good return in the property investing market.
I'm glad you said that. Because I want to reassure our investors out there who are listening, just because you have a 1-bedroom, or 1 resident villa or a 1 resident apartment doesn't mean there is no one for this vacant property that you have, which is a HPS or robust, because you can always have an intake of a $40,000 a year SDA funded participant who is qualified for a house, a group home, but wants to live in a villa. So really, at the end of the day, it's up to the investor, the landlord, to accept that application or not. So that way, you, Richard, you yourself say you agree. You have full control of who the incoming participant is, are subject to your decision to accept it or not.
Definitely. And that's not to say there aren't people out there funded for living on their own in a villa. Or maybe, I could accept someone that's funded to live with one or two others, and then they could potentially reapply to NDIS and they may get their funding changed. So there's some opportunities there, Min, but it's definitely a risk.
Exactly. So again, a lesson for our listeners to learn is, and I'll use you as an example, Richard. Even if you have a 2-bedroom HPS villa and you get a lower funded 35,000 plus RRC, fully accessible participant, that's probably 45, 50 grand.
Yep.
Even though you are hoping for a 75,000 number, for example, a round number, you can still take on board that client into this dwelling of yours and then either leave him be or let him go through the process, him or her, go through the process of the tribunal appeals, IAT, which is now being deregistered, but still there at the moment, to seek for higher funding for single occupant dwelling. Now, if nothing happens and they lose their appeal, you yourself can choose to leave him be and let him stay there longer, renew the lease, or once the provider or providers find an alternative higher funded participant in the future, then that's a matter of discussion between the provider, the current tenant, and the future incoming tenant to arrange a transition in and out of your property. So that's, again, you're in full control of that process yourself. So don't think that just because you have a $40,000 rental income at the moment means you're stuck with that. It's just subject to tenancy leases expiring and looking at more tenants in the future. And or the FA participant may have a degenerative disease and may fall into the HPS category in the future as well.
And that's it. I mean, in a rental market where the average rental return is $30,000, a fantastic return is $75,000 per year, but $45,000, $50,000, $55,000 is still a really great result. So I think anyone that goes in there that's sad that they don't get $75,000 a year of annual income is not doing the right thing. Be prepared for something lower, or if you want, just hold out and keep that dwelling vacant until you find someone that's funded to the level that you require.
Exactly. Now, I reckon the best way to explain to anyone listening to our podcast is we've heard the news on TV. Every vacant property in Australia has 20 or 30 people lined up at the front with their applications, right? That's just on the news every day now. The lack of stock around Australia for normal tenants renting a house. So as a landlord, they would get 30 applications and then they would then discuss with the real estate agent rental manager of the 30 applications, of the top 10, and then the landlord will choose from there. Okay? So just like that, the SDA landlord here will get his 5-10 applications. And the SDA provider will recommend to you as an investor, here are our top 4 or 5 we recommend, but at the end of the day, it's your choice as to who you want to bring on board as a participant or tenant in your SDA dwelling. So the control, the power is in your hands as an investor to who you want to bring on board, whether it's an IL, FA or HPS participant, and the lease is subject to negotiation between the two sides. That's it.
Exactly, Min.
So at the moment, how many builds are on the ground or happening in the Newcastle Maitland area, you think?
Look, there's definitely a few. There's a group home just gone through approval under complying developments, a few kilometres from where the dwelling is that I've currently finished. There's some other builders and developers in the area, but look, I'm not tracking it too closely, Min. I'm a fairly small player in the market, so I'm not at this stage not out to compete with the big developers. But talking to the providers, there's not enough SDA dwellings and builds occurring to meet current demand.
So if I looked at the SDA quarterly report right now from December 22, what are the rough numbers of supply and demand and deficit do you think the Newcastle area region will show?
Oh, I'm sorry, Min. I'm not quite familiar with that. I didn't check it to any level of detail because I'm only working in the small single digits. Unfortunately, I can't build all those houses for all those people at this time. And it still doesn't indicate those that would really like to move out of their group homes into new houses either. So I'm confident in the demand that's available not being met in the medium term.
Oh, by the way, can you educate our listeners, sorry, why would someone decline to move out of a group home into a new house? What would the reasons be?
Look, one of the potential reasons would be maybe they're living with their friends. Maybe the opportunities that are available do not allow them to continue living with their friends. Alternatively, they might have a different funding line in their NDIS package that dictates the level of in-home supports that they will be eligible for. So the group home might be providing them some shared supports, which when funded by multiple people actually gives them a higher level of in-home care than could possibly be funded if they moved out on their own or into a smaller SDA dwelling.
Exactly. My additional comment to that would be the new dwellings could be too far away from their natural place of habitat, where they grew up.
Yep.
Their friends are there. If they move out of the current group home with the current silver care provider, there's no guarantee that the new dwelling will have the same care provider either. Because normally there's an anchor tenant in the new house and they will probably have to end up switching care providers as well.
Yep, that's possible, Min.
So we've got 2 projects done and a third one coming up for you soon, is that right?
Yeah, so I've got 1 build completed and 4 dwelling builds in the finance and final stages of approval, ready to commence construction. Fingers crossed in the next couple of months, Min.
So knowing what you know, having gone through what you've been through already, when these 4 villas are built, what's next on the cards for you, Richard?
Look, personally, Min, I'll be building and developing further SDA properties with the intention of holding those. In the meantime, though...
But what type of dwellings? That's my question, sorry.
Of course. Yeah, what I'll continue to focus on would be the single residence, robust and high physical support dwellings. Noting if I build to high physical support, someone at fully accessible or improved livability is still able to move into those dwellings. So that is still a good result in the future if I can't find or can't get high physical support participants.
Wonderful. I think you should consider, if you want, doing designs that cater for all 4 categories. I've seen a few builders and groups out there around Australia, maybe about 50 or so out of construction, where they cater for the full hybrid design, where it's actually a HPS and a robust all-in-one. So you can cater for any of the 4.
It's something I've been discussing with the builder more recently, Min, and I'm definitely considering it for future projects to have that additional flexibility for high physical support and or robust.
Yeah. I think it should only cost another 40, 50K more than a HPS build cost of a villa there. So it should be a minor uplift in cost, but it should be on your horizon, on your radar if you want to start building a portfolio long term in the area. Yeah.
Exactly, man. The 2 main considerations would be the impact check, gyprock alternative for the walls, and then the change in glass would be the 2 main sort of cost drivers with that upgrade.
Wonderful. Well, mate, we'll be heading off into go to Newcastle as well in the coming few weeks. There's going to be, I'm not too sure when this podcast will be published, but there's going to be a networking event on the 10th of May in Newcastle. I'm talking to a events promotion group in Perth. They're going to run an event there, and then we're going to fly down to Newcastle ourselves. And hopefully I get to meet you and have coffee there when we're down there too, Richard.
That'll be great, man. I'll look forward to it.
Mate, any final words of advice that you may have for anyone who's thinking about going down more your route, so more hands-on approach in terms of location, builder, designers? 95% of the people around Australia are more the mum and dad, passive investor, engagement builder, engagement provider, just sit back and watch it get built. You're more active in your approach. Any words of advice for anyone who may be thinking about following your footsteps in terms of advice for them?
Sure. Anyone that's looking to be more active, Min, it's just get out and do the research. Talk to the providers, talk to the builders, talk to the designers. They either need to have solid experience in doing it or a real enthusiasm for learning and contributing to the space. Without either of those, just avoid them. Don't go for the lowest cost bidder on any of the projects because it'll be liable to bite you like I said on the construction, any one of multiple things would have meant non-compliances on the build would have meant that the whole dwelling just didn't comply with the SDA requirements, which meant, if you had someone lined up to move in, if you had 3, 4, 5 weeks of rectification works to do, then all of a sudden potentially you've lost that lead participants, and then it's back to the drawing board to find your participants again. And it's a lot of extra complexity and heartache that you're potentially not wanting to deal with. So go with either enthusiasm and or experience, preferably both.
We don't need enthusiasm experience. We need it now, Richard. Adding to what you just said there, if there are delays, lengthy delays, that could that could really throw a spanner in the works with your plan, with anyone's plan, because you have participants sitting there waiting for 8 to 9 months for your house to be built from the get-go. And if there's a 6-month delay in the construction delivery, there's no guarantee that the participant will be there waiting for you. They could move on straight away. And that's a risk that everyone has to have as well, yeah.
Exactly, Min. And the provider I'm working with, they're not even putting properties in front of participants until at least the slab is down. They're like, with the current building industry uncertainties, they're like, we just want to see substantial progress. We don't want to get people's hopes up and then have those hopes evaporate because, the house never gets built, or they miss out on other opportunities because they thought something would happen quicker or sooner than it actually did.
Richard, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate the in-depth summary of your journey the last few years. We hope to re-interview you again in a year's time and see where you're at. But something tells me you're going to be stuck on your 4th project by then. Good luck for everything, mate, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Fantastic. Thanks, Min.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure you are subscribed and following us so you can keep in the loop with all of our upcoming episodes. We would really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating, a written review, and to share this podcast with those that could benefit. Until next time, catch you on the next episode.